Hello, Rick here with a Federation lore bite looking at the Vulcans' actions during the early days of the Earth-Romulan War. Sorry if things sound a little off, lots of DIY has the place a bit barren, so sounds might be a bit different. So with that out of the way, let's jump into this interesting time in Starfleet's history. You see, things were not promising for the fledgling interstellar power of Starfleet, even with the backing of the newly formed coalition of planets. For a start, Earth had been singled out as the glue that had brought Andorian, humans, Tellarites and Vulcans together, and as such was the priority target for the Romulan Star Empire. But on top of this, there was another factor, the early growing pains of the organisation that would eventually give way to the United Federation of Planets. I mentioned in the prior videos that Vulcans had a bumpy start with humanity, and this did not simply disappear with the creation of the Coalition. In late July 2155, the Vulcan High Command, under the leadership of the Cyrenite and Kolinar practitioner T'Pau, chose to withdraw from active frontline engagements with the Romulan Star Empire. This caused much discomfort among the other members of the Coalition, who admitted that they could not make up for the loss of the Vulcans' fleet in patrolling and holding back increasingly aggressive Romulan forces, such as those who seized the Calder system and destroyed the original Kobayashi Maru. The reason behind this drastic, not very team-spirited action from the Vulcans was twofold and mostly confidential. First off, the Romulans had been deploying a new weapon, one that could hack into a ship's systems and usurp control of an entire vessel. There had yet to be a counter-system created that could repel this sort of attack, which had proved successful against the Klingons, see the early Starfleet Klingon video for more, and the Vulcans. In fact, Vulcan ships were at greater risk considering the similar systems upon which the vessels operated to Romulan design. The only vessels that seemed to be nearly immune to the Romulan remote weapon were Earth's, pretty simply because they were less advanced. That's right, full Battlestar Galactica up in this war, human ships were just too rubbish in comparison to the other contemporary powers. Not only that, but Vulcan ships, the most susceptible, were currently the fastest warp ships in the local area, being able to attain warp 7 and cruise at warp 6 easily. This was far ahead of human ships that capped out at 5.2, and Romulan ships which had a similar spec, and the Klingons who could only reach warp 6 with a healthily maintained bird of prey. A rarity. So, logically, the Vulcans concluded that they needed to keep their vessels away from the front lines, while the Romulan hijacking software was in play, thus denying them any potential prize of a Warp 7 engine. Equally, the Vulcan High Command was still abiding by its prime directive somewhat, and didn't want to give up its warp advancements to humans or anyone else for that matter. There was another reason for the withdrawal too, one kept a deep secret within the highest command of the Vulcan Council and the Vulcan Ministry of Security. Some had in fact recently learned of the heritage of the Romulan Star Empire, as those who left Vulcan en masse beneath the Raptor's wings before the time of awakening on Vulcan. This was kept as a highest priority secret, as the Vulcans didn't quite know what to make of this revelation and were busy conducting their own counters for infiltrating Romulan society. On top of this, recent worries from Earth, such as the Terra Prime incident, had the Vulcans concerned at the levels of xenophobia that may come their way if Starfleet found out. Kind of understandable, but honestly it demonstrates a profound lack of trust in their allies. Then again, this is the 2150s Vulcans we're dealing with here, still in the midst of their reformation. The decision to keep quiet was made by the ministers and the Vulcans' security sectors. Seriously, the amount of people who knew really was probably around a dozen. Vulcan security is divided up into several bureaus. First up there was the local security, the V'Kor, which were roughly analogous to a police force. The Vashar is the intelligence service, in the same way as Starfleet intelligence was, or the Tal Shiar was to the Star Empire. The Vashar was further split into divisions. The internal security was a relatively small department that dealt with things like uncovering spies and Vulcan isolationists, while the scientific bureau focused on staying apprised of all the latest advances and breakthroughs from other species. Galactic Security deployed agents in the field and analysts to comb data concerning the larger galaxy. Naturally, they had a strong focus on Romulus, considering the current circumstances, and even managed to embed a Vulcan agent on Romulus. Agent Sopek was placed under the cover identity of a Romulan called Ch'uif, who had to undertake actions on behalf of the Star Empire to maintain his deep cover. They also temporarily recruited Section 31 operative Charles Trip Tucker, which, oh yeah, he's alive in the Romulan War Enterprise books. And it gets a bit messy because the holographic record of 2161 we see in the finale of Enterprise had been doctored by Section 31 to say he died then, instead to keep his missions classified. This needs its own video. Tucker had been on a similar mission on behalf of Section 31, which had taken advantage of his injury in 2154 to fake his death and use him as an infiltrator to gain info on Romulus. His services were then commandeered by the Vashar, which means that Vulcan Intelligence on some level was even aware of the existence of Section 31, even if they did not fully understand its scope and duty at the time. The Vashar was still greatly involved in the Romulan-Earth War, however, even if the High Command had made the unfavourable move to pull its vessels back for core defence. They continued to analyse and operate in the shadows, tracking Romulan movements and supplying information to Earth's own Starfleet intelligence. Such contributions included uncovering the Romulan shipyard of Archinar 2, which was making worrying progress towards achieving Warp 6 or even 7, an advantage that they could not afford the Romulans, whose ships were only just breaking Warp 5 like Starfleet's. As it was, Starfleet was in danger of falling even further behind the Romulans as it rapidly tried to produce more NX-01 class vessels, but as mentioned in the series in 2154, Columbia and Enterprise were the only two at the time. The NX-03 and 04, Challenger and Discovery respectively, were still incomplete by mid-2155. Starfleet had been forced to rearm the old Daedalus class vessels with as much of the NX improvements as they could and launch these instead. So on paper, Starfleet matched the Star Empire for warp speeds, but in practice they only had 2 ships and a bunch of older Warp 4 vessels. One contribution that the Vulcans did make to try to even the field without direct intervention was the installation of a warp detection grid around Coalition planets to provide early warnings of approaching Romulan ships, supposedly even those under the early cloaking prototypes. Shame that only 3 months later, in October, the Daedalus-class USS Jaeger NCC-76 was ambushed by 3 warbirds over Deneva Colony despite the detection grid. The Vashar continued to exist as part of the Ministry of Security well into the 24th century, and by this time, much like the many other facets of Vulcan infrastructure, it benefited from a close working relationship with Starfleet, which itself was now a multi-planet, multi-species organisation, like its parent, the Federation. So, thank you for listening to another instalment of the early Starfleet history, this section drawn from the novel Beneath the Raptor's Wings, part of the Romulan War series, and I aim to bring you more apocryphal tales from this time. But if there's anything in particular you'd like me to look at, shout it out below. I'm building info on the Andorians' early involvement, but not much so far. So thanks again for watching, I've been Rick, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.